Hello, Scrufftards, Reject, and the occasional Vatnik. Welcome back to the Warzone. I'm Scruffy, and this is Scruffy Tales. And with things turning ever so slightly, but still quite visibly on the maps in Russia's favor up in Kursk, uh, I figured I would make a video about what potentially went wrong in Kursk for Ukraine. I've touched on this in a couple of other videos, but I figured why not make a video about it, speculating what may have gone wrong, and well, did anything go wrong at all? So let's get into it. But be warned, there will be a lot of talking, a lot of rambling, and well, join me if you want to. But I'm gonna do it anyway. I'm gonna post this shit anyway. So yeah, let's get into it. And just to highlight what I'm talking about when I'm saying that things are leaning in Russia's favor at the moment. As you can see here, this is the ISW map. They rely on geolocated units and positions to try and map out the front line. And uh, the blue combined with the yellow and red was Ukraine's furthest extent into Kursk around the 21st of August. And since then, as you can see, things have happened. Russia has pushed in. Red is confirmed Russian positions. So Russia has well and truly pushed Ukraine back, as you can see. Yellow is claimed Russian advances that have not yet been confirmed. So maybe we have Russians pushing out this way as well. Same thing over here, where Ukraine pushed into Glushkovo or towards Glushkovo. And since then, Russia has retaken this town and has made claims to have pushed down in the middle here to the border. So clearly, Russia is a bit on a roll here and pushing Ukraine back. And the question is, how did this come to be? Why is it happening now, and why has Ukraine not been able to hold on uh, more aggressively to the territory they gained? And we're gonna start things off with early 2024. This is a recent map, by the way, so this is not a map from January of 2024. This is the up-to-date map according to Ukraine Control Map. Anyway, so it all begins basically right at the start of 2024, where you have this static established front line in Ukraine. And Ukraine has tried to punch through in the south, didn't make it. Russia has struggled to push primarily up here, and as we all know, at Bakhmut and Chasiv Yar. No side is making any headway because what you have is massively defended lines, trenches, minefields, pre-sighted fire missions for artillery and drones everywhere, spotting every movement. You can't concentrate forces to push through because drones will spot it. And when you begin to make the move, artillery and drones will just fly in and destroy everything. So nothing was happening here. So I said in early 2024 that it was only a matter of time before Russia would build up something up either in Kursk or Belgorod and make an attack from the north. I said that's going to happen without doubt. And I also said and argued that Ukraine needs to do something similar, right? For the same reasons. There was no way to punch through these front lines. It just wasn't gonna happen. So if the Russians wanted to make any headway, they had to come in from the north. I argued that if Ukraine wanted to make any headway, they had to somehow make a move and get in behind the Surovikin line. You can't push through defenses like this. So my argument was that Ukraine would be trying to do it down here because they were slowly but steadily building up a very powerful amphibious force, and they are still building that force. They have something like 200 fast transports and assault craft provided by Western countries. So And recently we've seen them making strikes with these boats out here in the Black Sea against oil rigs. They shot down a Russian fighter jet with one of these boats. And we've also seen them conducting sabotage missions with attack divers in this area as well. So that thing is still ongoing. That may happen maybe this fall or sometime during 2025. But early 2024, I was convinced that this was going to happen in 2024, and that this was Ukraine's way to try and push around the Surovikin line and threaten Crimea. And plenty of voices said that no, 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 Ukraine can't do that. They expanded all their resources with this push here, and there's just no way in hell this year they're going to have to just sit tight, wait for reinforcements and supplies from the West to build things up again. And since Russia was launching attacks throughout winter, throughout spring, and especially here at Avdiivka, most notably at the time, I argued, and was convinced that no, Ukraine will try something in 2024, because an army that is not moving forward is losing the war. An army wants to move forward. It has to move forward. It has to have momentum, and it has to hold on and try at least to hold on to the initiative and the momentum. So I was convinced something was going to happen. This, I know. No, this was not on my bingo chart. I thought it was going to happen down here. But the Russians made this assault at Kharkiv, like I had predicted. And it had the intended effect. It drew a lot of Ukrainian forces away from the main front line. And that opened up, as we can see here, the purple. It has allowed Russia to make significant gains along the eastern front at a couple of locations: Chasiv Yar, Toretsk, Pokrovsk, even down here around Vuhledar, and here south of Kupiansk. And because this front, the Kharkiv front, demands troops, resources, fuel, manpower, ammunition, everything, right? Ukraine had to allocate vast resources to hold here, and that opened up possibilities for Russia along the eastern flank. At the same time, Ukraine was planning for a similar move. Maybe they were exploiting the fact that Russia had allocated 20,000 troops to Sumy. Ukraine was beginning to build up troops here to defend. Then those 20,000 were moved down here to support the assault on Volchansk, because the Russians got stuck. I'm fairly convinced they had the hopes to push in further south, not Kharkiv. They did not have the troops and manpower to assault Kharkiv, but to push further in to draw more Ukrainians up here. But they moved the 20,000 up here to support the 30,000 here. And that left, is my guess, Ukraine with a lot of forces at Sumy that were now not doing anything. And I think this is when they realized they stood a good chance of actually making that counter move that they had to make. They had a chance to grab initiative and to regain momentum that they really needed to achieve, because they were falling back all along the front line. And I think that is when they decided, we're going to make a move into Kursk because we have the forces in place. So let's reinforce these units and then make that move. And I think that is what happened, because they had to do something. They were falling back in the north and in the east, and they were making no headway at all along the static front line in the south. So that is why they pushed into here. And the hopes here, more than likely, was to force the Russians to fall back from in panic mode, potentially from Kharkiv, to contain this, attack this, counter this. And that, I think the hope was that then they could push back the Kharkiv front back to the border, and that would free up a lot of units that could have been moved down to Pokrovsk, for instance, or other places. And also, the plan more than likely was to hold on to these gains for as long as possible, forcing Russia to not only weaken the Kharkiv front, but also other front lines as time went on. Ukraine obviously expected a big response, a big push to counter their presence in Kursk. Uh, but they more than likely wanted to hold on for as long as possible and then force units from Kharkiv to move up, Kupiansk, Severodonetsk, and so on, forcing Russia to bring in more and more and more troops to Kursk to try and push the Ukrainians out. And over time, weaken the entire front line more or less, forcing Russia to stand down on a lot of locations and being unable to push on because they were occupied in Kursk. But why not use these units to fight back at Kharkiv, or maybe even try and make another push down here in the south, what have you? Well, we're gonna take a quick look. We're gonna return to fortification lines and how to deal with them, essentially. And we're gonna take three classic situations in history when it concerns warfare. We have Germany's invasion into France, the Soviet Union assaulting Finland in 1939, and we also have the Allied invasion of Kuwait and Iraq. So we're going to start off with the Soviets and the Finns. The Soviets wanted to push out of St. Petersburg straight for Helsinki. Swedish maps, by the way, that's why you're probably not recognizing any of the names. And they intended to go through this area here. The problem was that Finland had I believe it was three defensive lines in place. And what happened? Well, what you might expect, exactly the same thing that the Ukrainians ran into in 2023, trouble. Because you can't really advance on defensive lines like this head on. It just won't work. You will suffer for it. And the Russians really didn't make any real headway until they decided to allocate more forces north of, is it Ladoga, this lake? North here, and try and outflank the Finnish defensive lines, because this push didn't make any real headway, and Russia suffered tremendously because of it, as I suspect you all know. And it wasn't until they began moving up here that the Finns ran into some serious trouble and had to allocate forces left and right, and then the Russians could slowly push through towards Checksholm and Viborg. Old Swedish towns, by the way. Empire. Anyway, moving on. Next invasion dealing with a massive defensive line was, of course, when Germany in World War II decided to take on the French. Fun fact, France and United Kingdom declared war on Germany and not the other way around. And France had also made a push into Germany as Germany was invading Poland. The French actually invaded Germany. But for some reason they decided that they could not hold on. Not entirely sure, but they fell back anyway. And they had, of course, the famous Maginot Line that is misquoted as not working. It worked like a charm. And how do we know that? Well, we know that it worked because the Germans avoided it. Germany realized if we attack this defensive line head on, we will be doomed. We will die, be crushed, and we will lose the war. So Germany figured out that they can't attack this defensive line. They had to go around it. So what did Germany do? Well, the French and the British, they realized this as well. Germany will never attack the Maginot Line. They will attack Belgium. So they placed their armies on the Belgian border and just waited for Germany to enter into Belgium, and then the plan was to, we're going to move in and destroy the entire German army. That was the Allied plan. Germany, of course, realized that that was the trap set. So Germany moved into the north of Belgium and into the Netherlands, Belgium, Netherlands, and the Allies went for it, went straight for the German army, and that is, of course, when Germany sent in their armored units through Luxembourg and the Ardennes forest, came in behind the Allies, pushed out to the coast, trapping the Allies, rather cutting off the supplies leading to the Allied armies, and the Allies had to fall back. It was a complete disaster. We had the British trapped at Dunkirk, and the French should never be forgotten. The French put up stiff resistance defending Dunkirk to allow the British to escape. And of course, Germany then continued into France and overran everything and came up behind the Maginot Line, right? So here we have the Russians trying to go through. That did not work. They tried to go around. That worked better. The Germans realized, no, 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 going through means disaster. We're going around. 1991, 1991, the Gulf War. Iraq invades Kuwait, and a bunch of countries around the world says, hell no, we want that oil. So, United States and we have the Saudi Arabia here, but there were more allied nations in the coalition, decided we need to liberate Kuwait. And the Iraqis realized, oh hell, they're coming. So they built powerful defensive line, a proper fortified line here on the Kuwaiti border and off into the desert. And they also had numerical superiority. They had more troops, more tanks, more everything. So the Allies realized if we go straight in, we're gonna get crushed, because that's what happens when you go straight in against prepared defenses, especially when you're outnumbered. So the Americans put up a big maritime force with the Marines out in the Gulf. And they also had a bunch of allied nations represented here by the Saudi Arabian flag set up down here south of Kuwait, and this convinced the Kuwaitis that there was this unit here, these forces were going to lock them in place, and then the Marines would come in and attack Kuwait from the sea. So the Iraqis prepared to defend the coast and the border along between Kuwait and Saudi Arabia. What the Iraqis did not realize was that the entire American contingent, land forces, went out west. That was the alarm on my phone. Went out west into the desert with tanks, armor, mechanized infantry, and everything. And they moved around the defensive line and came up behind the Iraqis. Remember, they did this after having bombed Iraqi positions for a month with air power. And despite that, bombing the Kuwaitis for a month and moving in with allied forces to lock the Ukrainians, lock the Iraqis in place, despite all of that, when the Americans came in behind the Iraqis, they still ended up fighting the Iraqi quick response unit, basically a full army of armored tanks and BMPs, T-72s and what have you. And you had that massive armored battle out in the desert at 73 Easting, a battle that the Americans won, and they forced the Iraqis back, and the Americans came in behind the Iraqi defensive line. So as you can see, in order to overcome a defensive line like the Surovikin line in Ukraine, attacking head-on is not an option. You have to find a way to go around it to be truly effective. You still need to apply pressure to lock units in place, because once the enemy realizes, oh shit, they're outflanking us, they're obviously going to try and counter it. So applying pressure along the front line, like the Ally did in Iraq, is still necessary. You still need to lock forces in place so that you can push in around the enemy. It's basic fire and maneuver. The forces attacking the front line, they are the fire element, and then you have a maneuver element that goes in around to outflank the enemy. Kind of what we saw here. In the end, the Russians adopted some form of fire maneuver where the units down here applied pressure, became the fire element, and then you began a move up here that kind of became the maneuver element, even if the situations were basically the same but without these powerful defensive lines. So you need to lock units in place and then move around to overcome such powerful defensive lines. So with all of that in mind, what chance did Ukraine have of punching through here at the Surovikin line? I mean, they had no way of moving around anything. They had to push straight through. And I mean, all these orange markers are the Russian defensive lines, bunkers, trenches, what have you. How? There was just no way in hell. The Russians put up too much of a stiff resistance. They brought in too many reinforcements. They had too much firepower in the area. Ukraine was close to reaching Verbove and punching through here, has to be said, but the advance was just too slow. It took, how long did it take them? Was it 2 or 3 months to push this far before they could launch that attempt at Verbove? So I mean, this push should have taken, if I remember correctly, the Ukrainians planned to reach this far in a week, when it's in the end actually took 2 or 3 months or something like that. So as you can imagine, they spent too many vehicles, too many soldiers, too much resources to push this far. And when it was time to push through, they had spent most of their forces, is what I can gather from or what I remember, to be truthful. So yeah, I mean, yeah, in hindsight, I'm not sure how this was supposed to work, because attacking a fortified defensive line like this head on, historically, will not work. It just will not work. I mean, World War One kind of proved that definitively, and in World War Two, what did the armies do? They did their damnedest to avoid defensive lines like this and tried to move around. And in Iraq, it was proven yet again, you don't attack fortified lines like this head on. You try and move around it. And Ukraine just didn't have that option. And the offensive failed as a consequence. And that is, of course, why we ended up with this static line at the beginning of 2024. Russia was beginning to make advances in Avdiivka, and Russia realized that they needed to force Ukrainian manpower away from the front line. So they did this move in Kharkiv to bypass the defenses, to force Ukraine to allocate manpower, and Russia has now been able to push at several locations. And for the same reason, Ukraine has attacked up here. They needed to attack somewhere where they could avoid the defensive line. And they decided to move into Kursk with the hopes of forcing Russia to allocate vast amount of resources to this area, which appears to have happened. And now Russia is counterattacking and trying to push Ukraine out of Kursk. And we will now take a look at why Russia is having success so early on in this incursion, because I believe Ukraine had hoped to hold on for a bit longer before Russia made any real headway in this area. So here we are looking at the furthest extent of the Ukrainian incursion back in August, 20th of August, I believe it was, when we were informed that this is the extent of the Ukrainian incursion. They moved out this way, tried to reach the highways over here as well, and they had pushed out to the same river, and they were in a good position to try and surround and move into Koronevo. So I think this here, let's see if we can do something like this. Here and here is where this incursion failed. Because I think this was the plan for the Ukrainians. Move in and grab Sudzha like they did, with thunder runs and encirclements going on, which we saw they pushed in far along the roads and the highway network and surrounded a bunch of Russian units as they pushed in all along the border and linked up with their units that had utilized the road network. And then Ukrainians began, they secured this area here and they pushed out this way, but then fell back to not overextend. And pretty early on, they started moving north. So they grabbed Sudzha, the primary target of the incursion, and then they moved to the secondary target, which was Koronevo. And here the Ukrainians got stuck. And then, as they were fighting over here at Koronevo, they moved up to the river to isolate Glushkovo, this county, and they started blowing up the bridges and all the pontoon bridges and everything, and really isolated. I believe it was something like 3,000 Russian troops in this area. And Ukraine had reached the river, and they were now trapped, the Russians, over here. But Ukraine was still struggling with Koronevo. And this town was vital for the defense of this territory. Ukraine wanted Sudzha, they wanted Koronevo, and they wanted this town here, that is the town of Glushkovo. And these three towns were key to holding on to the incursion, to holding on to the gained territory. Ukraine failed to push into Koronevo. They had to allocate more and more manpower to try and achieve this objective. At the same time, Russia was slowly building up forces around them. They did not panic. Russia did not panic. They slowly built up an ad hoc force, taking units from here and there, so they did not weaken any front line specifically, section of the front line specifically, and then built up forces to contain the incursion and reinforce Koronevo. This forced Ukraine to have a substantial presence of manpower along the east and the northern flank. They also had to reinforce Koronevo, and that meant that this push here could no longer continue westward towards Koronevo, to Glushkovo, because you had something like 3,000 Russians is the figure that's floating around the internet, holding this area south of the same river. And Ukraine pushed in with 10 to 15,000 troops into this area. And if Russia was slowly building up forces all around this area, Ukraine had to, have forces along this entire front line, plus trying to push into Koronevo. That doesn't leave all that many units left to push into the 3,000 holding this area. And if you have, say, 1,500 Russians were holding this front line and the rest, the other 1,500 were holding the border, Ukraine would have needed at least 3,000 troops to attack here, preferably 4,500, a 3-to-1 advantage. That is what you usually try and achieve when you're going on the offensive, a 3-to-1 advantage in any given firefight. So if Ukraine needed 3,000 or 4,500 out of 10,000, I mean, that's not doable, since you need to attack Koronevo and you need to hold this entire front line. Not doable at all. And even if you have 15,000, that's still a third of your force fighting here when you need to hold all of this plus attacking here, right? So Ukraine had run into some serious issues here with the entire operation. They had not taken Koronevo and they were not pushing west towards Glushkovo. And these were key. Remember, they needed Koronevo because Russia was eventually going to build up to counterattack, and in order to hold that counterattack, Ukraine needed Koronevo. This is a town situated right on a river, and that would have been easily defended by Ukraine. The same thing with the Sudzha, also a town on a river. I mean, we've seen Ukraine holding Chasiv Yar and Vovchansk for months on end, because there's a river and a town, and Russia is struggling with that combination. So this would have been a powerful defensive obstacle for Russia to overcome, and Ukraine failed to grab it. And because of this, they also couldn't push on westward to grab Glushkovo. So, but what do you do when you end up with a problem like this and this, when you can't push in and when you can't push through? Well, as we've seen historically, what you do is you move around. And this is why I think we've seen Ukraine pushing in over here. They wanted to outmaneuver this section of the front line to push into Glushkovo, and in so doing, freeing up all their units here, and also the units that took part in this push, and grabbing Glushkovo. These drawings are excellent, and that would have allowed them to free up units to help out with Koronevo in the end. Russia, on the other hand, had other ideas, obviously, since they launched their push from Koronevo to Snagost and then moved in towards Yubimovka. I don't think that these two pushes, I don't think this was a attempt to outflank this push to Snagost. I think this was Ukraine was basically building up for this to outflank this front line. And at this point, Russia launched their attack from Koronevo to Snagost, and Ukraine said, we can't wait, we have to try something to prevent this from being exploited. So they moved in probably ahead of time before they were ready to launch this incursion. With the hopes, and here's what I think happened next, they did this with the hopes of forcing Russia to allocate forces from here to contain this. But that did not happen. Russia kept pushing in towards the center of the Ukrainian lines, and they have since grabbed something like this, according to ISW. And they have merely tried to contain this here. So this kind of mimics Kursk and Pokrovsk. Russia pushed hard for Pokrovsk, and Ukraine attacked here. Russia did not let themselves be distracted by this push, so they kept going for Pokrovsk and allocated other forces sporadically from the front line to contain this incursion until they had built up forces to launch their counterattack. And I think we're seeing something similar here. Russia made this push, Ukraine came in here, and Russia said, we're going to focus on the plan and keep pushing in towards the center and just try and contain the Ukrainians over here. Right? They're going to try and contain them while focusing on the main objective. And the main objective is cutting this supply line here. If Russia can reach it, Ukrainians up here, potentially, this is an old map, but a month ago, but then Ukrainians who are still up here may have to be forced to fall back. So that is what I think is going on in Kursk, and why the units, the Russians and the Ukrainians have done what they have done. Russia wanted to, hang on, we'll do this. Yeah, I warned you at the beginning that there would be a lot of rants and ramblings, right? So that's what you're getting. Russia wanted to push from Koronevo to Snagost to open up this road here into Glushkovo, between Koronevo and Glushkovo. Because this here, the Ukrainians reaching the river, that was a real issue for the Russians. It was only a matter of time before Glushkovo County would fall to Ukrainian hands. So Russia pushed here to open up this road, this corridor into Glushkovo. And then the Russians decided, or the second part of the plan was to push this way along the highway while they still had momentum, while the Ukrainians were falling back from this area. So Russia pushed down here, forced the Ukrainians over here to fall back so that they would not be cut off, surrounded, and trapped. And since the Ukrainians were falling back here, and they were falling back up here as well, to an extent, that gave Russia momentum, and Russia decided to try and utilize it, and they went straight for Yubomivka. This is where Ukraine crushed the Russian advance here with drones, artillery, and javelin missiles, I read somewhere. But Russia followed that up by attacking with these forces along this axis here, and forced Ukraine back further still. And so what Russia is trying to do with all of this, these pushes, is to reach, like I said, this highway here and this intersection. And because if they cut this road here, the Ukrainians up here will not have secure logistics. It will take longer to bring in reinforcements, longer to supply them, and they will not be able to bring in as much of everything that is needed because they have lost this main highway. So the Russian plan makes complete sense. They had some issues here, but as we've seen on the ISW map, they have steadily pushed Ukraine back in the area, and they are almost at this very important highway. So we're jumping ahead to the 20th of September 2024, Andrew Perpetua's map. And here we are. As you can see, Russia has pushed out to the east, forced Ukraine back. Ukraine is currently struggling in Glushkovo. And Russia is, I think it's something like 3 kilometers from this position here to this highway. And there is a crossing here. There's also a crossing down here and one in the middle. So they can get across if they're pushing in south of Yubomivka instead of following the main highway here. And according to ISW, Russia has crossed over the river Snagost, and that means they could potentially push in this way south of these lakes to reach that vital highway and supply route. So what are Ukraine trying to do over here? Is this a push in to reach Russian lines in the rear? I don't think so. Maybe as a if the opportunity presents itself, maybe. But I mean, the Russian lines, they are like how many? 15 kilometers away from the Ukrainians in Glushkovo. So I don't think that is what the Ukrainians are after. I think Ukraine is after reaching the river and to grab this territory here, because they want to hold territory in Kursk. I mean, they need to hold territory in Kursk to continue forcing Russia to allocate manpower to the area. So if they are losing territory over here in Koronevo and falling back towards Sudzha, they need to somehow replace these losses, and they can do that in Glishkovo, and this is an area that they can defend. They have a river up north that will prevent Russia from pushing in from the north, and there's a narrow choke point here that they can defend. Even if Russia were to try and push in through Ukraine, you still have rivers and what have you in place, making it difficult to enter this area. So this is a very well defended location, which is why Ukraine wanted to push in here in the first place, in order to have this defendable area, have this defendable town, and have there's also a river surrounding Sudzha, so you have a very defendable area here as well. So these three locations were the main three objectives of this operation, is my guess. And they got stuck in Kornevo, failed, and this part is still ongoing despite the failure of pushing west through this section, front line here. So no, I don't think Ukraine will be pushing eastward here to try and catch the Russians in the rear. I don't think that was the plan at all. They are pushing in to secure Glishkovo with the hopes of forcing Russia to pull forces from the front line to engage Ukrainians over here, relieving the stress on this section of the front as a result. So they want Russia to abandon, to lose focus over here and move them over here, so Ukraine has an easier time of stabilizing the front. At the same time, Ukraine will try and reach this river so that they can cut off the remaining Russians here, south of the river and between the border, to then clean up and do mop-up operations. Ukraine has an option, though, if they reach the river, sorry, to then move east to reach the Snagost River. It goes down here and connects with these lakes and continues down here, something like that. Because then Ukraine, I mean, it's only a couple of kilometers if you reach this far, this small town here, only a couple of kilometers to the Snagost River, and then you can secure this railroad crossing and potentially push out and secure this bridge right on the edge of Snago, the town of Snagost. Town of Snagost is here, and the bridge goes south of the river. If they do that, then all of the Russians south of the Snagost River are in a bit of a they are in trouble, because then they have no supplies, they have no reinforcements, and so on. But these are big ifs. That means, first of all, Ukraine needs to push up. Hang on, I'll do this. Away with you. Ukraine has to first punch through Russian defenses here and reach the river, which they seem to be struggling with at the moment. And then from there, they need to push out towards this river Snagost and secure the bridges as they move along. So, not very likely, if you ask me. I think Ukraine is at the moment focusing on reaching the river, which has been their main objective all along, is my guess, and then grabbing this area to hold territory they can defend. Meanwhile, they will probably fall back steadily from the Russian advances in the son of a... Sorry about that, here along this flank and the northern flank, until they have fallen back towards Sudzha. That goddamn cough just won't give up. It's annoying as hell. Anyway, this is Sudzha. We have the town. It's you have suburbs on the eastern side of the river, and then you have Sudzha itself on the western side. And as you can see, here you have the Russians pushing up along right at Yubimivka, trying to reach this highway. If Russia pushes in with forces, which they will, Ukraine has some 10 to 15,000 troops in the area, and we have seen reports from 40,000 to 60,000 Russians gathered in Kursk. So Ukraine is massively outnumbered, anywhere from 3 to 1 to 6 to 1 are the estimates. Ukraine cannot hold on to territory in Kursk over time, I should add. So I think, and that is why they needed Koronevo, by the way. They needed that town to lock the defensive lines in place so that they could hold out for a couple of months and then slowly withdraw as pressure mounted, as more and more Russian units were allocated to Kursk. So I think Ukraine was under no, they were not delusional. They knew that eventually the pressure would be overwhelming in Kursk and that they would have to fall back. Hopefully, after a couple of months, forcing Russia to allocate thousands and thousands of troops here, weakening other parts of the front line in Ukraine. And the end goal of the plan is, my guess, for Ukraine to eventually, over time, surrender territory around Sudzha. That is more than likely the plan because, like I said, they know Russia will send in so much forces eventually to Kursk that Ukraine can't hold. So Ukraine is probably planning on falling back to this river, holding Sudzha, holding these suburbs, and making this their last stand in Kursk. And this will probably be a significant obstacle for Russia when we get this far. Sudzha especially. We know from Bakhmut, we know from Chasiv Yar, from Vovchansk, that a town and a river spells disaster for the Russians when they're trying to assault such a location. Russia will more than likely try and push in on the flanks across the river, but it's a river, naturally a very well defended obstacle in the terrain. This son of a bitch, this cough, sorry. And but yes, this is what I think Ukraine will be looking at in a couple of months, probably, hopefully, well into 2025. So I think, like I said, Ukraine will, over time, fall back to hold this part here. Over time, slowly falling back to these positions around Sudzha, setting up shop, heavily fortify the river and the town itself, try and hold on to territory on the outskirts for as long as possible, and then slowly fall back. Trying to draw this out for as long as possible, forcing Russia to bring in more and more units to forcefully force Ukraine back and trying to push the Ukrainians out of Kursk. At the same time, I think Ukraine will try and focus on reaching the river and securing Glushkovo for the same reason. Russia cannot attack from the north. They will be forced to come in from this angle, this vector, trying to push in between the river and the border. As you can see, you have waterways going into Ukraine as well. So Russia can't really push across the border to outflank the Ukrainians here in Glushkovo. They will be forced to come in this way, head on. And like we pointed out in the beginning, attacking a defendable line like this head on, not doable. And if they can't move around on the flanks, it's gonna be costly as hell for Russia, is my guess, to try and push through here. Assuming that actually Ukraine actually achieves this. That's the assumption, that Ukraine actually achieves this in the long run, and that will force Russia to attack head on. And question is if Russia can pull that off without sustaining horrific casualties. And if you take a look at this part of the battlefield as well, Russia could try and push into Ukraine to outflank this river, but I mean the river continues into Ukraine, and here you have a town that defends the edge of that river. So that's going to be a struggle for Russia as well if they try and move in behind to maybe cut this supply line. Wouldn't surprise me if they tried this. I mean, if you cut this supply line, Sudzha falls basically, so Russia may be trying to push in south here. to reach the supply line, but my guess is that Ukraine has some pretty decent defensive lines in place to prevent that from happening. But this is basically it. In the long term, hopefully, my guess is that it will continue into 2025, but you never know. But my guess is that this will continue into 2025. Ukraine will hold on to Glushkovo. Ukraine will hold on to this part here at Sudzha. In time, Russia will slowly push them back, and Russia will probably suffer tremendous casualties, and hopefully they will be forced to allocate more and more manpower to the region, weakening other sections of the front line down in Ukraine. So, all in all, has this incursion failed? Well, it's too early to tell, frankly. It is too early to tell. Famous historical general who wrote a lot of famous theories on warfare, von Clausewitz. I mean, his entire point was that you don't know if a military maneuver was brilliant or not until it was completed. While it's happening, yes, you can see smart moves as it is evolving, but you don't know until the end if it was brilliant or not. And so, kind of, I mean, so it's just too early to tell. We don't know if this was a brilliant move or not, or if this was a brilliant move. I mean, this push here has forced Ukraine to allocate a lot of manpower to Kharkiv, which more than likely has allowed Russia to push in this way, push over here, and help them push along the axis here towards Pokrovsk, right? So you could claim that this operation in Kharkiv was a success from that point of view. Likewise, this could still be a success in the end, even if they did not reach Koronevo, even if they did not manage to push on into Glushkovo, as the intention was from the beginning. Because Ukraine always knew that Russia would allocate vast amounts of manpower to the area and then slowly force Ukraine back, which is currently happening. Maybe as many as 60,000 troops has been allocated to Kursk, taken from various parts of the front line. And the hope is for Ukraine that this continues, that they can hold on to their some of their gains, and forcing Russia to move more and more manpower up to Kursk. Should Ukraine use these forces to push the Russians back at Kharkiv? Would that have made any difference? Who knows? Same thing for Pokrovsk. Should have used these forces to halt the advance down here. Who knows? I mean, there's no way of knowing until the end of it. That's the boring answer. People may argue, oh, they should have done this and this and this instead. Since we don't know the logistical side, we don't know how much manpower is available, what vehicles and how much fuel and ammunition. It's impossible to tell for us who are just looking on by, taking a look at some open source intelligence maps. So I'm leaning towards that this is doing the intended work of forcing Russia to allocate manpower to Kursk. Ukrainians are in a bit of trouble since they did not grab Koronevo. That was a big fail. They failed in that objective, and that has opened up for Russia launching a early counter push into the occupied territories in Kursk. But we'll see if Ukraine can stabilize the front line. That may still happen. Russia may still push in towards the center of the Ukrainian control area. That may obviously also still happen. We are just going to have to wait and see what the situation is at the end of this weekend and a couple of days into next week. But yes, overall, Ukraine failed. As in so far that they did not grab Koronevo before Russia launched a counterattack, and they failed in pushing into Glishkovo. And I think the flanking maneuver that we're seeing in Glishkovo was intended to bypass Russian forces defending Glishkovo. It had nothing to do with that push into Snagost. Ukraine just happened to have forces in place that could push in to try and relieve the front line as Russia made the move to Snagos and then later to Yubimivka. That's gonna have to be it for this time around. I hope you found it interesting. I hope I'll see you in the next one. And if you stuck with me to the end, I am impressed, because I can imagine that this is a bit of a boring video, to be perfectly honest. But I just felt like doing it. I kind of had to get it out of my system that the push into Kursk probably makes sense, but Ukraine failed in grabbing Koronevo. They got stuck pushing into Glishkovo, and they needed to address this somehow and decided to try and outflank the Russians in Glishkovo. At the same time, not grabbing Koronevo allowed Russia to launch a counterattack early into the Ukrainian occupied territories. Had Ukraine held Koronevo, it would have taken much longer for Russia to make such a effective counter-assault, basically. So anyway, enough of this. The end of the video. As always, go på marsch, Ukraine, and give them hell.